Well, it's a real pleasure to be here in Puerto Rico again. I was here a short 41 years ago, and I hope to come back, make the next interlude much shorter than this. The subject I want to talk about is industrial policies, growth strategies, a learning society. And I want to begin by putting the issues I want to talk about in broad historical context. Literally for thousands of years, standards of living of most people around the world were stagnant, hardly budged at all. And it's only been in the last 200, 250 years that there has been a dramatic change in living standards. If you look at a graph, it looks basically flat, and then all of a sudden starts to increase. The obvious question is what happened 200, 250 years ago? This has been a subject of enormous amount of research. The point I want to raise from this perspective, this talk, is that most of the growth that has occurred is related to changes in technologies, to learning. Capital accumulation played a role, but secondary role to the accumulation of knowledge and the dissemination of knowledge. But the second important observation is that this change in technology is endogenous. It didn't just happen. It's a result of human endeavor, a result of efforts on the part of individuals, the creation of institutions to learn, to educate, to disseminate ideas. It's a result of what we do. If that is true, and I believe it is, it means that understanding the forces that lead to learning and to changes in technology are absolutely at the center of development. And it also means that understanding the processes by which we learn, the processes by which we absorb changes in technology, and those changes in technology disseminate throughout the economy, are central to an understanding of development. From an economic perspective, the production of knowledge is different from the production of ordinary goods like steel. From a technical point of view, economists refer to the knowledge as like a public good. It's like an externality. When you produce a knowledge, everybody in society can benefit. When you're sitting in a chair, only one person can sit in a chair at a time. But now that I've shared with you what I know, I still know it, but now perhaps you know it as well. Thomas Jefferson, who was America's third president, put it very forcefully. He said, and much more poetically than economists put it, he said, knowledge is like a candle. When one candle lights the other, it doesn't diminish from the light of the first candle. And that has an important implication because it means that market processes, market forces on their own are not likely to be optimal in either the way that extent to which they produce knowledge or the way that knowledge gets disseminated. There is going to be a critical role for government. That role of government is associated with creating what are sometimes called national innovation systems. It will go beyond beyond intellectual property. There's been a lot of discussion of intellectual property, but I believe it's been overemphasized. It's important in some areas. In fact, it's necessary in some areas. But in other areas, it's become an impediment. In many areas in innovation in the United States, we worry about the patent thicket, where any innovator, the moment he has an innovation, becomes prey to everybody claiming that he's using somebody else's knowledge. There's a whole industry now, a legal industry in the United States called patent trolls that go around buying up patents, waiting for somebody to invent something that they can sue. And in the United States now, there are more expenditures on lawyers for protecting and extending intellectual property are greater than expenditures on research. And any society in which these transaction costs exceed the real production is obviously not an optimal way of running a system. Historically, there have been large problems with our patent system. The airplane, most of you know the story of the Wright brothers and the patent that they got. But what you may not know is actually the innovation occurred almost a half century earlier in Brazil. It's just that the patent office in the United States didn't know that. But then the patent office made another mistake. It gave 2 patents. It gave a patent to somebody else, and they didn't know. And anybody wanting to make a further development of the airplane, a follow-on innovation, had to pay royalties to both of these. And if they paid the royalties to both, there was no profitable innovation. And if they paid royalties to one, the other one would sue. So the development of the airplane in the United States was arrested for a long time until World War I occurred. It was more important for us to be able to drop bombs on Germany than paying any attention to the lawyers and intellectual property. So we nationalized the patents. We took them over, formed a patent pool, and the US government decided who was going to get what money. And the airplane then got developed. But that was a real example of a patent impeding innovation. Same thing happened in the car industry. There was a patent that was given for a 4-wheel vehicle, a self-propelled vehicle, and the person who got the patent wanted to use the patent to create a monopoly, a cartel, and used it in that way, high prices, until Henry Ford came along and said, you know, I want to create a people's car, a low price, a Ford. And, but he couldn't do it because the cartel wanted only high price. So he sued and said, this is not a valid patent. He had some setbacks, but eventually he won. But if he hadn't won the suit to overturn the old patent, the car would have been delayed for years. Our climate would be better, but the automobile would not have developed as quickly. The general point I want to make is that the intellectual property regime that so often talked about is part, but only one part, of our learning system, of our innovation system, and that the patent system can have adverse effects on both the level and the direction of innovation that can be distorted. And that's why there's one of the reasons why there's an important role for government that I'm going to come to in a minute. The example that I just talked about of intellectual property also raises another fundamental point, that there are critical trade-offs between short run and long run. I say the patent system illustrates that because I mentioned before that knowledge is like a public good, that there's no marginal cost to an additional person using knowledge. Efficiency requires the full dissemination of knowledge once it's produced. But if we did that, there would be no incentive, there might not be adequate incentives to innovate. So the whole patent system is based on a trade-off, understanding that we get an inefficiency in the short run. In fact, the inefficiency can be even greater because we give monopoly power to the owner of the patent, a certain degree of monopoly power, it's restrained, but that we know that causes an inefficiency, but we believe that it's offset by the dynamic gains. Recent research has suggested that if you don't have a well-designed patent system, you may not even get the dynamic gains, but at least that's the theory. Well, the same thing holds true for development more generally. There's been a long-standing argument called the infant industry argument for protection, and more recently I've extended that to what is called the infant economy argument for protection. The argument is a very simple one, that at some times certain kinds of trade policies that might in the short run have a cost might have a long-term dynamic benefit. Korea illustrates the point I have in mind. 40 years ago, 45 years ago, Korea's per capita income was very, very low. In fact, it was lower than India, which means that its per capita income was something, a couple $100s a year. The average level of education in Korea was about 4.3 years. So it was a really less developed country. World Bank and the IMF looked at Korea and said, your comparative strength is in growing rice, and you should grow rice. And Korea said, that's not very interesting, growing rice. And even if we are the most successful rice growers in the world, we'll be poor. We won't learn to become a more developed country. So Korea said, we're not going to pay any attention to what you tell us. We like your money, but we're not going to listen to you very carefully. So they went ahead and they started a whole set of policies to promote their various industries, chemical industry, eventually the automobile, the chip industry. And now they're the 12th highest level income country in the world. They're actually engaged in giving now development assistance to other countries. The broad point I'm trying to raise here is that over the last 50, 60 years, we've come to understand a couple basic points about development. The first is that development is possible, but not inevitable. The successes that we've seen in East Asia over the last 40 years were totally unanticipated and greater than had been experienced anywhere else ever in the world. On the other hand, development is, these successes are not inevitable. There have been countries that have not succeeded in growing. So we've now learned that success is possible, amazing development, and but it's not inevitable. Gernot Myrdal was one of the earliest winners of the Nobel Prize in Economics, spent some time in Asia in the 60s, and an example of the remarkable forecasting ability of economists. Just as Asia was about to grow enormously, he gave a forecast that Asia would be mired in poverty forever. And what he did, he looked at what was going on. He said, the possibility of growth, there's no possibility here. There's rigidities, there's no, that it's likely to remain like it's been for hundreds, thousands of years. Well, he was wrong. And why was he wrong? What he didn't fully appreciate was the ability of these East Asian countries to learn. And that's the next key issue. The point is that we now understand that what separates developed from developing countries is not just the gap in resources. There is a gap in resources, but it's not just that. That gap in resources was what influenced the creation of the World Bank. The point of the World Bank was to transfer resources from the developed to the less developed countries. And there was a realization that markets didn't do that very well. But we now recognize that it's not just the gap in resources, it's the gap in knowledge. And that is really the reason that there is this enormous difference in living standards between the developed and the less developed countries. The World Bank has recognized this and actually now talks about itself more and more as a knowledge bank, as an institution trying to think about how do we transfer knowledge, learning from the developed to the less developed countries. And the East Asian countries were the most successful ever in figuring this out, figuring out how not just education policies, but technology policies, policies of industrial policies that I'll come to in a minute, can play an absolutely vital role in closing the knowledge gap that separates the developed from the less developed country. What I described before in the case of Korea is an example of a broader array of policies called industrial policies. Korea understood that if it was going to learn how to produce steel, the only way it was going to learn how to produce steel was to produce steel. You couldn't just read about it in a textbook. The economists refer to this as learning by doing, learning by production, learning by investment, learning by learning. And that's why it introduced a set of policies to try to create an industrial sector, but also a set of policies that, having created that industrial sector, worked hard to make sure that it learned, that it absorbed the technology, and that it could transfer that technology, what it learned, from one part of the economy to the other. These policies that I've referred to as industrial policies, let me make clear, are not just about manufacturing. They can apply to agriculture, to telecommunications, to any sector of the economy, to finance. So all that they're referring to is policies which are directed to changing the structure of the economy, and to encouraging certain sectors that it believes have spillovers, benefits to other sectors, particularly with respect to learning. Now, of course, all countries have such policies, have industrial policies. The only thing is, some countries don't know it. And the danger is that when you don't know it, you become prey to industrial policies being shaped by special interest, shaped in a way that does not necessarily maximize the well-being of society. Industrial policies are embedded in all the laws, the regulations, and the expenditures that governments undertake. We often talk about legal frameworks as necessary for a well-functioning market economy. But there's not a single legal system. We make choices whenever we pass laws about what kind of economy, and we ought to think more about what implication they have. For instance, if a country doesn't have good antitrust laws, it winds up with monopolies. And the returns for monopolies are often very high. That leads to a distorted economy. And it distorts the economy in many, many ways. For instance, the United States, telecommunication costs are very high, about 10 times the cost that they should be, because we don't have a competitive telecom industry, and there's some proposals to make it a little bit less competitive going on right now. What is the consequence? The consequence is not just that we have more resources in the that we have a distorted telecom sector, but it's also that all the other parts of the economy that depend on telecommunication are de facto taxed. Another example where we've been active antitrust action in the United States, the credit card companies charge what is called an interchange fee, which is a fee they charge the merchant when they engage in, when you buy something with a credit card. That fee can be anywhere from 0.5% to 4%. It's effectively a tax on every transaction that goes on through debit card, credit cards, which are today most transactions at the retail level. But it's a tax that doesn't go for public purpose. It's a tax that goes for private gain. It distorts the economy like any other tax, but it distorts it even worse because it leads to a distorted economy. Now, one of the main functions of a financial system is to have low transaction costs. But this is a high transaction cost. Modern technology would allow for these kinds of transactions, for money to move from your bank account to the merchant's bank account at a fraction of a penny, not at a charge of 1, 2, or 3, or 4%. So this distorts our economy. It moves money from ordinary citizens up to the financial sector. It has a very adverse effect. Finally, in the Dodd-Frank bill, there was a provision that was called the Dermot Amendment that said on the debit cards, not on the credit cards, but just on the debit cards, there had to be a limit. The banks couldn't just charge, the credit card companies couldn't just charge whatever they wanted. But then they made a mistake. They delegated responsibility for the implementation of this provision to the Federal Reserve. And some people describe the Federal Reserve as a wholly owned subsidiary of Wall Street. That may be an extreme view, but the result of that was that the regulation allowed them, it brought down the fees considerably, but they were still a multiple of the cost. And a federal judge looked at this and said, this is unconscionable, and threw it out. And is now in the court, as you know, American legal system, it will go to appeal and appeal and appeal, and maybe sometime in the next decade we'll find out what will happen. But that was only on one part, only on the debit cards, not on the credit cards. Other countries have dealt with this problem. Australia has dealt with the problem and put a limit and allowed for a whole set of changes in the restrictive practices associated. But that's just one example of antitrust laws, corporate governance laws, affect the structure of the economy. Let me just give you one, what might seem an arcane issue, which is bankruptcy law. Bankruptcy law affects who gets paid in the event of a firm not being able to pay its creditors. I hope none of you ever get into that situation. But the question is, who gets paid first? And the U.S. bankruptcy law, almost unique, I think, in the world, said the first person to get paid were the derivatives, the CDSs, those financial instruments that had led to AIG's bankruptcy and a $180 billion bailout. At the same time, that bankruptcy law, unbeknownst to most people, was a provision that said that education loans could not be discharged even in bankruptcy. Again, unique in the world. Well, these provisions affect the industrial structure of the economy. They say they are de facto a subsidy to the financial sector, de facto discourage investments in education. Well, industrial policies have long been controversial. Critics of industrial policy have said government's not very good about picking winners. Actually, the government has a very good, credible history of picking winners. We did a study when I was chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors of the returns to government research enterprises, and they were literally, average returns were in excess of 50%. And of course, there were some big winners, like the internet. But there were a lot of winners in agriculture and other areas of biotech, in lots of areas. The the huge increases in agriculture that have occurred over the last 150 years have largely been based on government-funded research. The first telecom innovations, the first telegraph line was financed by the US government. So it wasn't just the internet. There's been a long history of over 150 years. Indeed, most major innovations have been based on government-funded research. And a recent book has come out called The Entrepreneurial State, documenting the extent to which this is true. So industrial policies are not, though, about picking winners. They're about identifying spillovers and what economists call externalities. And this is really the big point that a great economist, Albert Hirschman, made many years ago. He studied successful development in Latin America, and he emphasized the linkages across sectors of the economy. And the point is that when you have successes in one sector, if they're linked with other sectors, they can have spillovers, benefits. And the successful countries have tried to figure out what are those critical sectors, have tried to figure out how do they maximize the learning and maximize the learning spillovers. They've been very successful in doing that. Of course, innovation is linked with a large number of other market failures. Typically, firms that are engaged in research have a hard time financing that research. Unlike real estate, you can't get collateral. If you have a research project that doesn't pan out, there's nothing there to take. Also related to the fact that research, like many other activities, entrepreneurial activities, are very risky. But you can't get any insurance against this risk. There's good economic theory explaining why that's the case, but the fact is that it is the case. The result of these market failures that I've described, the spillovers, the imperfections of credit markets, the limitations in risk markets, mean that inevitably government, civil society, and others will need to take an active role in promoting learning and promoting innovation. The most successful countries, those in East Asia, understood this and actually developed a comprehensive set of policies to address all of these problems. Malaysia, for instance, just to give you one example, when it began its development strategy, had a lot of oil, but understood that it didn't know how to extract the oil. So it had to bring in foreign oil companies. It knew that. But it didn't just bring them in. It said, if you're going to come into our country, you have to teach us. We don't want you to just be there. We want to use this as a basis of learning. And so as part of the conditions of companies coming in, they began to learn. And today, Malaysia's oil company is teaching other developing countries how to extract oil. It's become a multinational where it is now exporting not only oil, but exporting ideas, the ideas that go into it. There are many other examples like this. As I say, learning doesn't come automatically, it doesn't come on its own, but some countries have figured out how to get those learning benefits and have succeeded in doing that. The importance of these views, the importance of industrial policies, is one of the major changes in development thinking that have occurred in the last, I would say, 2 decades. When I was chief economist, I tried to promote this idea, and that continued. And the last chief economist, Justin Lin from China, made it the centerpiece of his 4 years as chief economist. He talked about the important role of industrial policy and what he referred to as a structural transformation. He emphasized, in particular, taking advantage, having industrial policies that promoted learning, but also took advantage of a country's natural advantages. Trying to figure out what those natural advantages are is obviously a difficult question. Some countries, for instance, might have a better climate where you could have 3 crop seasons a year. So if you're doing seed development, you can do it a lot faster for GMO research than you could in an environment, in a climate where you could have only 1 seed crop a year. Many of the issues of industrial policy are national, but some states within the United States have been successful in promoting their own development. For instance, Maryland is one example of such a state within the last few years. States have been called laboratories of democracies, but I don't think we've spent as much energy learning from the successful ones as we should. Now, when I say successful, I want to be clear what we mean by success, and this is a little bit of a digression, but I think it's an important point. Success should not just be measured by GDP, or as you do in Puerto Rico, by GNP. GNP is better than GDP, by the way. The difference, for those who don't follow these details, GDP is the official output produced in the country. GNP is the income that goes to the citizens of the country. And those two can be very different. They are very different in Puerto Rico. They're very different in Ireland. Part of that is for the same reason. There's a lot of transfer pricing, and income that is assigned to the production here is actually fake income and doesn't actually occur here, but most importantly, doesn't go to the citizens of the country. It's also true in any economy in which there's natural resources. There can be a lot of production of, say, gold in Papua New Guinea, but all the revenue of that gold goes to the companies outside of the country that are doing the gold mining. Small smidgen goes to Papua New Guinea, and meanwhile, Papua New Guinea is left with all the environmental and health problems. So if you looked at it in terms of a correctly measured GNP, you would say that this gold mine probably lowers GNP, the well-being of Papua New Guinea, even if GDP goes up. So with globalization, GDP has become an increasingly bad measure. GNP is better, but still doesn't incorporate a number of features. I'm going to come to that in a second. I always found it interesting that the world shifted from GNP to GDP just when globalization became more important. And I always wondered whether there was a political agenda in this. Well, I chaired an international commission on the measurement of economic performance and social progress, which try to look at different metrics of how we assess success. And one of the important things that we emphasized, we concluded unanimously that GDP is a bad measure, that it didn't include metrics of sustainability, for instance. Before the crisis in the United States, 2008, many people thought the United States was doing very well. And I remember going to Europe and everybody saying, what can we do to imitate the United States growth model? You don't hear that quite so much anymore. But the point was that we were growing by GDP, but not sustainably, because it was growth based on a mountain of debt. But probably even more important was the fact that while we were growing, most citizens' incomes were declining. And so this is a fact that most people outside the United States don't know, and many people in the United States may feel it, but they don't know it. And that is median income, the people in the middle, half above, half below, median income in the United States today is lower than it was almost a quarter century ago. There's been essentially no growth for decades. And median income of a full-time male worker in the United States is lower than it was 4 decades ago. So if you wonder why there's seemingly some discontent in the United States, some anger in some segments of our society, it's not a surprise. One should expect even more anger than we've seen, because for large groups in our population, large groups, a majority of citizens in some areas, some demographics, things have not been going well. Well, I want to move on to talk about what are some of the ingredients that go into a successful industrial policy. And obviously, the industrial policy for each country has to be different. But there are a couple of ideas that I think I want to put forward. One is, one of the advantages of being a small economy is that you don't have to do everything. There are lots of advantages of being small. One of my friends actually talked about judo economics, that there are some things you can do when you're small that big countries can't do. But for a small country in particular, success can be achieved by developing even a limited number of special competencies. The second is, education will be one of the key factors. And education is important not just because of the training, but universities are actually really key to success of modern economies, modern learning societies. Now, I always feel embarrassed when I start talking about this because, we always talk about special interest. And now I'm talking about my own special interest. I'm in the education sector, and of course I think education is important, but it actually is. You look around in the United States and you say, what's the most successful part of the economy? The basis of real change, not the basis of the instability that we had before the crisis, but the real dynamism of the American economy. And most people point to Silicon Valley. Still, relatively small part of our economy. Hardly shows up in GDP statistics, worth noting that. Isn't let me emphasize, not a panacea. Just as a interesting observation, Apple was, for a while, was the largest capitalization of any company, larger than General Motors. But do you know how many jobs Apple actually created in the United States? Under 50,000, of which 30,000 were low-paid retail workers. The rest, 20,000, you might say good jobs. All jobs are good, but I mean middle-class jobs that paid what people would aspire to. And all the other jobs were exported outside the United States. And meanwhile, Apple was a company, I hope there's nobody here from Apple, but it's an important message to take back to your CEO. Apple was not a good citizen, to put it bluntly. It took ideas that were being produced by the universities, supported by the government. You could not have had the success of Apple without the internet, without the investments of government in the internet. And even the browser, the first browser, was funded by the US government. It was willing to take, but it wasn't willing to contribute. And it used that same innovation to make those beautiful iPads and all those other devices. It used that same creativity to avoid paying taxes. From an intellectual point of view, you look at some of the tax avoiding strategies and you say that they were brilliant. But from a social point of view, you have to say, I wish they used that creativity to make our society better off. And they created these firms that existed only in hyperspace, in cyberspace. And so they didn't pay taxes anywhere in the world. So not only were they, as I say, they took from the knowledge pool, but they weren't willing to make a contribution to put back into the knowledge pool. Well, it's not an accident that the most active part, the most dynamic part of the US economy, Silicon Valley, is where it is. It's because of Stanford University and the research funds that went to Stanford University from the US government. It created a whole area of interaction between universities and the private sector. And it spawned new ideas like MOOCs, the new way of delivering education to hundreds of thousands of students free. That's an outgrowth of Stanford University. So the university has fed into the private sector, and there's been some feedback both ways, but it's been a close collaboration between the private and the government sector, but it's underlying this has been strong support from the government. So education and thinking about how to promote, translate the knowledge that's produced into economic activities is going to be critical. The third is, while education is necessary, it's not sufficient. There has to be enterprise and job creation. But that won't happen on its own. That will require finance. And unfortunately, financial sectors, at least as they've developed in the United States, have not been as interested in making loans as they have been in other other activities. They played an important role. The venture capital firms have played a very important role in Silicon Valley, but they are a small, small part of our entire financial industry. Most countries in the developing world have found that if there's going to be enough finance, there has to be a development bank. But even the United States has a development bank. We don't call it that because the banks don't like the idea of there being a competitor. But there is a development bank for small enterprises. We call it the SBA, the Small Business Administration. We also have a development bank called the Export-Import Bank. Jokingly used to be called Bank Boeing. The Small Business Administration has made important loans that have created whole new industries. You all probably know about Federal Express, overnight delivery. You might say, well, what was Federal Express doing getting a small business loan? Isn't it a major multinational corporation? The answer is every large corporation became small. And at one time, Federal Express was tiny. But it couldn't get funds from an ordinary bank, and it got an SBA loan. And without that SBA loan, arguably, this whole industry would not have developed. So government enterprise helped create this overnight delivery system that has now spawned, become a major industry around the world. Historically, there have been lots of problems with development banks. But we've learned how to create, make development banks successful. No institution is perfect, and anybody looking at private financial institutions, I think most people would say they haven't been perfect, to put it mildly. But the development, we've learned from the failures to create development banks today that are very successful. Brazil, for instance, has a development bank, BNDES, which is actually much larger than the World Bank. And it just lands in Brazil. The Andean countries, Colombia and its neighbors, have a development bank, which has been so successful that all the other countries in Latin America wanted to join it, and it's now become a whole regional bank. a bank that can borrow at lower interest rates than the countries that are members of that bank. So thinking about how do you create finance that enables new enterprises to develop is going to be essential. Just to put this again into perspective, in the United States as a whole, 6 years after the collapse of Lehman Brothers, funds to SMEs, small and medium-sized enterprises, are still about 20% below the level that they were the pre-crisis level. And it's one of the reasons why the recovery in the United States is so weak. The fifth point I want to raise is, in a first best world, industrial policies would entail not just macroeconomic policies, but adjustments of exchange rates. But in the absence of exchange rate mechanism, something else has to be done. Europe, for instance, today is coming to grasp that for a common currency to work, much is required. A single market can be unstable, with money flowing from the poor to the rich. Money is leaving Spain and Greece and moving to Germany. So a system has been constructed which is dynamically unstable. It's the opposite of what Europe talked about before at the time it was established. Before it was established, they signed a treaty called the Maastricht Treaty. They were worried about this issue, and they designed a set of criteria called convergence criteria. But in fact, because they didn't understand the economics of convergence, they actually imposed conditions which have led to divergence, to an unstable situation where the poor get poorer and the rich get richer, and the two get further and further apart. Over the long term, Germany has made a mistake. Not helping Greece early on has been extraordinarily costly. Not helping Greece now will continue to be very costly. The EU has been titrating assistance. It's the minimum necessary to avoid the breakup. It's too little to lift Greece out of the deep depression in which they're in, a depression worse than the Great Depression. It's too little to return Greece to growth. The result of this is that there is a lost generation, in fact, lost generations, with an unemployment rate in Greece today of well over 25%, a youth unemployment rate of well over 60%. There's a process of going on of the hollowing out of the country. Many Greeks, had they known what they know now, would have left the EU. They realize they have paid a very high price for being part of the currency union. And equally disturbing, what began as a political project to unify Europe has been totally divisive. Well, the point I wanted to make is making a common currency work is extraordinarily difficult. A large literature in economics called the optimal currency area has been addressed to what is necessary to make it work. We know what is necessary to make it work, and it can work, but it won't happen on its own, just like industrial policies don't happen on their own. What is necessary is to think very deeply about what are the conditions necessary to make it work. What worries me is that the U.S. has been imposing some rules that are actually disadvantaging Puerto Rico. And what is needed is a growth strategy and the end of policies that have disadvantaged Puerto Rico, like the Jones Act, including those that have not granted it the flexibility that it needs to address the particularly adverse problems it has faced. In the past, the policies that have been tried are basically one version of another of tax subsidies, and these can help, but on their own, again, they won't suffice. One of the things that has been learned around the world is that special economic zones giving tax preferences often have little spillovers. The industries are foot loose. One needs to have policies that identify linkages and exploit these linkages that make sure that the knowledge, the learning occurs, and that it spills over to the rest of the country. Examples are these are not the special economic zones that isolate, but the kinds of Silicon Valley experiments where you bring people together and focus explicitly on the learning spillovers. So let me conclude. Puerto Rico has been, to put it mildly, going through a difficult time. And the government, I'm sure, is aware of these difficult times. It's partly a result of the political framework with the United States. I've already alluded to some aspects of that, and clearly what is needed is more flexibility. There's a debate about the policies that would improve things on the demand side, policies that would improve things on the supply side. But it seems to me that it is imperative for the government and for civil society to articulate a comprehensive agenda for what would be needed to make the system work. The current system is clearly not working. And there are things that could be done to make it work. And I think one has to be, I think, aggressive about defining what those conditions are. But of course, it's only partly a result of the political framework with the United States. It's partly a result of its own economic policies. These probably play an important role in the high energy prices, for instance, which disadvantage Puerto Rico. Technology has changed, and with those changes in technology, there's no reason why energy prices should be at the level that they are. Again, what's needed is a comprehensive agenda. Sharing a common currency has both advantages and disadvantages. I talked about the lack of flexibility, but it also brings with it stability. It's imperative, if one has this common monetary union, as it might call it, common exchange rate, to make sure that there's a flow of funds, and that's where the design of the system of finance becomes absolutely imperative. It's imperative as well for there to be active government policies to promote productivity increases, the kinds of industrial policies that I've been talking about. Think tanks like the CNE can play a key role in this, in defining and articulating for the public what is necessary and increasing the transparency with which the debate over what are the appropriate policies is conducted. When the U.S. went into crisis in 2009, 8 and 9, Rob Emanuel, who was the chief of staff of President Obama, said, "We shouldn't let a crisis go to waste." Unfortunately, I think the Obama administration did let it go to waste. It did some things, but it could have done a lot more. So in conclusion, my hope for Puerto Rico is that it won't let this crisis go to waste, and that by addressing the challenges that Puerto Rico has been facing for many, many years, the crisis will open up a new chapter in the island's history. Thank you.